Mark Dalton had never considered his quiet suburban life anything special. Nestled on the edge of a neat little HOA community where lawns were trimmed to perfection and fences gleamed in the afternoon sun, his modest home was just another in a long row of cookie-cutter houses. The rules were strict, the meetings tedious, but life was predictable until the spring appeared. It started one crisp, early spring morning. Mark had been out repairing a section of his backyard fence after the winter storms, when he noticed something unusual. Near the old oak tree at the far end of his property, the soil was damp and soft, strangely out of place after weeks without rain. Curious, he knelt down and dug his fingers into the earth, expecting to find a buried root or a misplaced hose. Instead, a cold trickle seeped between his fingers, pure, clear water. Puzzled, Mark followed the damp patch uphill. To his amazement, water bubbled up from the ground itself, forming a tiny, natural spring, no bigger than a garden hose but steady and cool. He knelt by the pool of water, cupping it in his hands and tasting it. Fresh, sweet. Like the mountain streams he'd only seen on vacation, it was a secret, a gift hidden beneath his feet. For days, Mark kept the spring to himself, quietly enjoying the novelty of having his own private water source. But he knew the HOA was watching everything in this community, from lawn heights to paint colors. A spring water source? That would raise eyebrows. His suspicions proved correct when a thick envelope arrived on his doorstep one afternoon. The HOA's official letterhead bore down on him like a warning. The words were cold, legalistic. This letter serves as formal. Notice that the HOA claims ownership and control over all water sources within the community boundaries, including underground springs. Your continued use or diversion of said water without HOA approval constitutes a violation of community covenants and will result in fines and legal action. Mark's heart pounded as he read the words again and again. "You're kidding," he muttered. How could the HOA claim his water? It was on his property, his land. But the letter made it clear. The HOA was serious. Over the next few days, Mark tried to reach the board president, an icy woman named Susan Blake, hoping to negotiate. His calls went unanswered. Emails were ignored. The HOA seemed intent on taking the spring from him without discussion. Worse, whispers started circulating among neighbors. Mark was hoarding community resources, breaking the rules, being a troublemaker. One evening, Mark stood on his porch staring at the damp patch near the oak tree. The spring bubbled gently, oblivious to the chaos it had caused. The neighborhood looked serene under the glow of street lamps, but Mark's mind churned with doubt and anger. What right did the HOA have to steal from him? What if they succeeded? What if his spring was gone tomorrow, drained or fenced off? And then there was the letter pinned to his front door that night, a chilling final warning taped under his welcome mat. Turn over the water or face the consequences. Mark's fingers trembled as he unfolded the note, the shadows around his house seeming to grow darker. The fight was no longer just about water. It was about control, power, and standing up to a neighborhood that suddenly felt more like a cage. But Mark wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The morning after the ominous warning appeared on his door, Mark awoke to an unsettling silence. The usual hum of lawn mowers, children playing, and neighbors chatting was gone. It felt as if the entire community was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. Mark's phone buzzed relentlessly. Texts, emails, even calls from neighbors he barely knew. Most messages were cold, some downright hostile. "Why? Are you making waves? Stop causing trouble for the rest of us. The HOA knows what's best." It was clear. The tide had turned against him. Determined not to back down, Mark drove to the HOA office, a nondescript building where Susan Blake held court. But when he arrived, the receptionist barely looked up. "She's not taking visitors today," she said curtly. then added with a warning smile, "Maybe try the community meeting on Thursday." Frustrated but undeterred, Mark began digging into the HOA's governing documents, searching for any clause that could support his claim. Buried within pages of legal jargon, he found references to common resources and community water rights. He read and reread, realizing the HOA's claim wasn't just a bluff. It was grounded in the fine print that many homeowners had never read, but a deeper question gnawed at him. Why was the HOA so desperate to control water? Was it just about rules, or was there something bigger? One evening, Mark's curiosity led him to the neighborhood's oldest resident, Mrs. Jenkins, a retired historian with a sharp mind. Over tea, she shared stories of the land's history, explaining how the spring had been a natural landmark long before the community was built. "The water flows from an ancient aquifer," she said. "If you start messing with it, it could affect the whole area." That night, Mark sat at his kitchen table, piecing it all together. The HOA's claim wasn't just about controlling the spring on his property. It was about controlling a vital resource, a resource that could affect every homeowner in the neighborhood. Suddenly, Mark's private battle took on a public dimension. Tension ratcheted higher when Mark received a visit from an unexpected source. A shadowy figure in a hooded jacket who slipped an envelope under his door before disappearing into the night. Inside were copies of emails between HOA board members, revealing secret meetings and plans to build expensive irrigation systems using Mark's spring water, without his consent. His heart pounded. The HOA wasn't just trying to regulate. They were scheming to profit from his spring. Days later, Mark's lawyer arrived, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Rachel. Together, they pored over the HOA's covenants, water rights laws, and the newly uncovered emails. Rachel warned Mark, "You're up against a powerful group who knows the rules and how to bend them." But they might have overlooked one critical thing: your legal property boundaries and water rights under state law. Rachel suggested an unorthodox approach, to fight the HOA not just with passion, but with cold, hard law, finding loopholes and precedents that could protect Mark's spring. They want control? Fine. We'll show them how control works when it's in your hands. Meanwhile, whispers began to spread in the neighborhood. Neighbors who once greeted Mark with nods now avoided him entirely. At the grocery store, conversations stopped when he approached. The once friendly community was fracturing, and Mark felt the isolation like a physical weight. But there was one more unsettling discovery. A surveyor hired by the HOA had been mapping Mark's property extensively, more than necessary for a simple boundary check. It hinted at something bigger. The HOA was preparing to take aggressive legal action or worse. That night, Mark lay awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the thought that the next move could change everything. The fight was no longer about a spring. It was a battle for his home, his rights, and his sanity. The final moment came as Mark checked his mailbox one evening. Inside was a thick packet stamped with official seals. The HOA had filed a lawsuit demanding immediate access to the spring and threatening eviction for non-compliance. Mark's hands tightened around the papers. The war had begun in earnest, and the shadows only grew darker. The morning sun cut through the thin curtains, but Mark barely noticed. His world had narrowed to one thing: the lawsuit from the HOA, which threatened everything he owned. Ignoring the growing pile of mail on the kitchen counter, he dialed the bin number for Rachel, his new lawyer. Her sharp voice on the other end was a lifeline amid the chaos. "Mark, the HOA's legal claims have some teeth," she warned. "Their covenants give them broad powers. But the trick is, they can't override state water rights laws. We need to find a way to prove the spring belongs to you and that the HOA has no right to control it." Mark felt a flicker of hope. "So, what's the plan?" Rachel paused. "First, we need a surveyor and hydrologist. Someone who can document the spring's flow, prove it's natural and entirely on your land. Then we dig into past records, old maps, environmental reports, anything that can support your claim. Mark nodded, even though she couldn't see him. I'm in. As Rachel arranged for experts, Mark began to notice subtle changes around his property. The ground near the spring had fresh tire tracks. At night, distant headlights flickered near his fence. Someone was watching him. One afternoon, while inspecting the spring, Mark found a small device hidden under a bush, a camera, pointed directly at his water source. The realization hit hard. The HOA wasn't just fighting him in court. They were spying. Despite the pressure, Mark pushed forward. The hydrologist arrived, an earnest young woman named Lisa who set up equipment around the spring, measuring flow, rates, and water purity. Mark was fascinated as she explained the science. This spring wasn't just a backyard curiosity. It fed into a larger underground aquifer that supplied the entire neighborhood. But Lisa's tests uncovered something unexpected. Evidence suggesting the HOA had diverted water from the spring years before, redirecting part of the flow into community. Irrigation systems, all without informing homeowners or obtaining proper permits. Mark stared at the report, heart pounding. So, they were already using my water? Lisa nodded. Yes, illegally. If you can prove this, it could blow the HOA's case wide open. Armed with new evidence, Mark's spirits lifted, but so did the stakes. Late one night, the tranquility of Mark's neighborhood shattered. A thunderous crash echoed through his backyard. Rushing outside, Mark found a section of his fence torn down and water pipes severed near the spring. His carefully monitored water flow was disrupted. The message was clear. When Mark reported the vandalism to the police, their response was lukewarm. Property disputes are civil matters, the officer said. Call your lawyer. Rachel's next visit was grim. Mark, the HOA is desperate. They're using every dirty trick in the book. We have to be smart and prepared. Together, they crafted a counter-strategy. Rachel filed a motion requesting the court to order the HOA to cease any interference with Mark's property, citing the vandalism as evidence of harassment. Meanwhile, Mark began documenting every detail, every late-night noise, every suspicious visitor, every new threat. But the real breakthrough came when Rachel uncovered a decades-old legal precedent involving a similar case in a neighboring county. A homeowner had successfully defended their natural spring by proving exclusive water rights tied to their property deed, a case that forced an HOA to back off. Rachel smiled grimly. This is our ace. The plot thickened further when a local journalist caught wind of Mark's story. The reporter's interest promised public attention, a double-edged sword that could rally community support or paint Mark as a troublemaker. Late. One evening, as Mark prepared for the upcoming court date, his phone buzzed with an anonymous text. Be careful what you dig up. Some secrets are better left buried. Mark stared at the message, the weight of unseen enemies pressing down. The battle was no longer just legal. It was personal. The vandalism was just the beginning. Over the next few days, Mark noticed strange things happening around his home. His mailbox was smashed. Tire tracks circled his driveway at odd hours, and the faint smell of gasoline lingered near his garden. Someone was sending a clear message. Back off or face worse. Despite the threats, Mark refused to be intimidated. He kept detailed logs of every incident, installing security cameras and motion-activated lights. But the more he resisted, the harder the HOA pushed. At the next HOA board meeting, tensions erupted. Susan Blake, the board president, laid out the HOA's position with cold precision. Mr. Dalton is a danger to our community's harmony and resources, she declared. His refusal to comply with community standards forces us to consider all options, including foreclosure. The room buzzed with whispers and gasps. Mark sat stiffly, meeting the eyes of neighbors he once called friends. Some avoided him, others stared with suspicion or resentment. The community was fracturing, torn between loyalty to the HOA and sympathy for Mark's fight. That night, a chilling new threat arrived, an anonymous package left at Mark's door. Inside was a crudely drawn map of the neighborhood with his property circled in red. Scrawled beneath it was a warning, "This is only the beginning." Mark's resolve hardened. He knew the HOA's intimidation tactics were meant to break him. But the longer he fought, the more he realized this wasn't just about a spring. It was about power, control, and who really held sway in the community. Rachel, his lawyer, urged caution, but supported his courage. "We need evidence, Mark. Proof that the HOA is acting outside the law. Their attempts to sabotage you could be their undoing." Meanwhile, Mark's neighbors began to murmur among themselves. Some had questions. Why was the HOA so aggressive over one spring? What was hidden beneath their manicured lawns? A few brave souls quietly reached out to Mark, offering small acts of support, a meal, a nod of encouragement, a listening ear. One of those neighbors, Dave, an amateur historian, shared something astonishing. Decades ago, before the neighborhood was developed, the spring had been part of a disputed water source between local landowners. A battle settled only when the land was divided and the HOA formed. The water rights had never been fully clarified, leaving a legal gray area ripe for exploitation. Armed with this new insight, Mark and Rachel dug into county archives, unearthing old land deeds, maps, and legal documents. Their research revealed a crucial fact. The HOA's claim to the spring water was built on shaky ground, based on outdated and possibly forged documents. The story took an unexpected twist when Mark received a call from an environmental regulator. The agency was investigating complaints about the HOA's water management practices, sparked by Mark's growing evidence. They warned him to be careful. His fight had caught the attention of powerful interests. That night, as Mark sat reviewing the mountain of documents, a low rumble shook the house. Rushing outside, he found water gushing from a broken pipe near the spring, flooding his backyard. Whoever wanted to ruin him had struck again. But this time, the water threatened to spill beyond his property lines. Mark faced a terrible dilemma. Act quickly to stop the flood and risk giving the HOA ammunition, or let it run its course and see what happened next. His decision would change everything. The water spilled relentlessly across Mark's backyard, pooling near the fence that separated his land from the HOA's manicured common areas. Panic surged, but beneath it was a spark of determination. This wasn't just a disaster. It was an opportunity. Rachel arrived just as Mark was directing a frantic effort to contain the flood. She listened carefully as he explained the strange letter from the environmental agency, the broken pipes, and the mounting evidence against the HOA's claims. "There's a way to fight back, and it's rooted in the law," Rachel said, pulling a thick binder from her briefcase. "I've been digging through state water rights statutes. There's a little-known loophole. If you divert natural runoff water onto neighboring property without malicious intent, it can be legal under certain conditions. It's called the Tao Natural Runoff Doctrine." Mark raised an eyebrow. "So you're saying if I let the spring water flow onto the HOA land, even if it floods their lawns, it could actually protect my rights?" Rachel nodded slowly. "Exactly. The key is that the water must flow naturally, without causing permanent damage or trespassing beyond your immediate neighbors. If done carefully, the HOA's attempts to control the spring could be turned against them." Mark's mind raced. The HOA had tried everything: threats, vandalism, lawsuits. But what if he could flood their precious green spaces, forcing them to face the consequences of trying to steal his water? Over the next few days, Mark and Rachel crafted a plan. They would engineer a controlled diversion, channeling the excess spring water across his property and into the HOA's common areas in a way that looked like natural runoff. It would swamp their irrigation systems and flower beds, turning their perfectly trimmed lawns into soggy messes. But it had to be flawless. If the HOA could prove intentional harm, Mark could lose everything. With the help of Lisa, the hydrologist, and Dave, the local historian, Mark mapped out the terrain and water flow paths. They identified natural channels where the water could flow legally and without causing structural damage. Mark built small trenches and barriers on his land, guiding the water's path with precision. At night, under the cover of darkness, Mark and Rachel installed discrete sensors and cameras to monitor the flow and document everything. The neighborhood buzzed with rumors. Some neighbors whispered about Mark's crazy flooding scheme. Others suspected the HOA was about to retaliate with full force. Mark felt the pressure mounting. If the plan failed, he risked losing not just the spring, but his home. The first signs appeared just before dawn. Water began creeping steadily across the property line, soaking the HOA's prized flower beds and creeping up onto the soccer field's sidelines. The HOA scrambled to respond, sending landscapers and contractors to dig trenches and build dams, but the water kept coming. Mark watched from his porch, heart pounding. The tension in the neighborhood was palpable. The once peaceful suburb was turning into a battleground of water and wills. Then, unexpectedly, some neighbors started to smile. Children splashed in the flooded fields. Parents joked about the new lake in the park. The HOA's carefully maintained order was slipping, and Mark's quiet rebellion was sparking a ripple of delight. But Susan Blake, the HOA president, was furious. She called emergency meetings, legal consultations, and threatened to sue Mark for willful property damage. Mark and Rachel were ready, armed with their research, recordings, and witnesses. The stage was set for a showdown that could reshape the entire community and Mark's future. The morning air was thick with tension as Mark stepped onto his porch, the sun casting an eerie glow over the soggy fields that had once been pristine lawns. What had started as a small trickle was now a steady stream, creeping across the HOA's common areas, swallowing flower beds and turning soccer fields into marshes. Neighbors gathered along sidewalks, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others laughing and splashing in the unexpected ponds forming before their eyes. The community that once prided itself on order and perfection was unraveling, one flood at a time. Inside the HOA office, Susan Blake was a storm of fury. Phone calls flew back and forth as she demanded urgent action. "This is sabotage," she barked at the landscapers hired to fix the damage. "Find out who's responsible and stop them now." But Susan's rage couldn't stop the water, which continued to follow the carefully engineered channels Mark had set up. The more they tried to build barriers and reroute the flow, the more water found new paths, infiltrating the HOA's prized flower beds, playgrounds, and even the clubhouse parking lot. Mark's phone rang constantly. Neighbors divided, some pleading with him to stop, others praising his courage. A few even confessed privately that they had suspected the HOA's greed all along. At a hastily called emergency meeting, the HOA board accused Mark of intentional property damage and announced plans for an immediate lawsuit. Susan's words echoed through the room. "We will recover every dollar and ensure Mr. Dalton faces consequences." But Mark was calm. Rachel stood beside him, presenting detailed maps, legal documents, and water flow data proving the flooding was a natural runoff within Mark's rights. The room fell into a stunned silence as neighbors absorbed the evidence. The turning point came when Dave, the neighbor historian, stood up and shared the community's forgotten past. How the spring had been a shared resource before the HOA's formation, and how past water disputes had been swept under the rug. "Maybe it's time we face the truth instead of hiding it," he said quietly. Rumors swirled that some board members were secretly negotiating with Mark to find a peaceful resolution. But Susan refused to back down, determined to crush what she called a rebellion. As the floodwaters rose, a few brave neighbors began documenting the scene on social media, sparking wider interest. Local news reporters arrived, cameras rolling as Mark explained his side of the story. A David and Goliath battle over water, fairness, and community control. Meanwhile, the state environmental agency stepped in, prompted by the increasing complaints and media attention. Inspectors arrived to assess the spring and the flood damage, adding a new layer of complexity and scrutiny. Late one evening, as Mark reviewed security footage, he noticed something alarming. Figures in the shadows near his property line, moving, equipment suspiciously. The HOA was still playing dirty, trying to sabotage his efforts. The flood had transformed the neighborhood. Some homes now surrounded by water, community events canceled, and the once perfect image shattered. But Mark's quiet defiance had awakened a community divided, forcing questions about power, property, and the right to nature's gifts. As the sun set over the flooded fields, Mark stood firm, knowing the battle was far from over. But for the first time, he wasn't alone. The floodwaters were no longer just water. They were a line drawn in the sand, dividing the neighborhood into camps. Some saw Mark as a hero standing up to a tyrannical HOA. Others viewed him as a reckless agitator disrupting their peaceful lives. At the next community meeting, the tension was palpable. Mark arrived with Rachel and his growing band of supporters, ready to face the board once more. The meeting hall, usually a place of polite small talk, buzzed with heated whispers and guarded glances. Susan Blake took the stage first, her voice cold and commanding. This neighborhood deserves better than chaos and destruction. Mr. Dalton's actions are illegal and selfish. He's jeopardizing property values and safety. Mark rose calmly, eyes scanning the room. I never wanted this fight, he said. I only want what's mine, the spring beneath my land. The HOA's control is based on shaky claims and secret deals. We deserve transparency and fairness. Several neighbors nodded in agreement, including some who had previously avoided Mark. Even the local journalist, now a regular at meetings, captured every moment with keen interest. The flood had exposed more than just water disputes. It revealed deep fractures in the community. Neighbors argued openly, alliances formed and broke. Some HOA board members whispered about a coup, hoping to oust Susan and salvage the HOA's reputation. Meanwhile, the environmental agency's investigation deepened. Inspectors uncovered violations in the HOA's irrigation permits and water management practices, bolstering Mark's case. The agency issued warnings and fines, placing new pressure on the board. One unexpected ally emerged, the HOA's former treasurer, who quietly approached Mark with a stack of internal emails revealing corruption and cover-ups by board leaders. The revelation shocked the community and turned public opinion further against Susan and her allies. Susan's grip began to slip, but she fought back fiercely, threatening to sue neighbors who spoke out and trying to rally loyalists for a final stand. As the legal battle loomed, Mark prepared for court, gathering witnesses, expert testimonies, and mounting evidence. He felt the weight of the neighborhood's hopes and fears on his shoulders. Late one night, a call came that changed everything. The environmental agency was ready to testify on Mark's behalf, confirming the spring's natural flow and condemning the HOA's interference. But just as victory seemed within reach, a new threat surfaced. The HOA's lawyers sent a surprise motion claiming Mark had deliberately caused flooding beyond legal limits, demanding immediate injunctions and penalties. Mark stared at the papers, heart pounding. The fight was far from over, and the waters, literal and figurative, were rising higher than ever. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Mark took his seat, flanked by Rachel, Lisa the hydrologist, and a small group of neighbors who had become his unlikely allies. The HOA's attorneys were there in force, their confident sneers reflecting the heavy stakes on the table. Susan Blake sat stiffly at the HOA's table, her expression guarded but tense. The battle that had splintered the community had come down to this final showdown, an all-out legal war over a simple spring that had turned into a symbol of justice and power. Rachel opened the case, laying out the evidence meticulously. Maps, water flow charts, old land deeds, environmental reports, and even the explosive emails from the former HOA treasurer painted a picture of an HOA overstepping its bounds, using deception, intimidation, and illegal water diversion to seize control of Mark's spring. Lisa testified clearly, explaining the natural runoff doctrine and how Mark's flooding was a lawful, natural response to the HOA's interference. The courtroom listened intently as she demonstrated how the HOA's irrigation systems had been illegally tapped into Mark's water, supporting his claims of theft. Then came the environmental agency's representative, who condemned the HOA's mismanagement and confirmed violations that warranted fines and corrective measures. Mark's neighbors gave heartfelt testimonies, sharing how the HOA's actions had divided the community and how Mark's stand had sparked a long-overdue reckoning. Susan's defense tried to paint Mark as a reckless vandal, claiming the flooding was intentional sabotage causing permanent damage. But Rachel's cross-examination revealed inconsistencies and lies that weakened their argument. Hours passed, tension mounting with every testimony and objection. Finally, the judge called for a recess. Back in chambers, the judge's decision came faster than anyone expected. The HOA's claims were dismissed. Mark's property rights and water rights were upheld. The HOA was ordered to cease interference, pay damages for the vandalism Mark endured, and cooperate with environmental authorities on restoring the neighborhood's water systems legally and transparently. Susan Blake's tenure ended abruptly. The HOA board was dissolved and replaced by a committee, including Mark and several reform-minded neighbors committed to fairness and community spirit. But the biggest surprise came afterward. During a casual conversation with the new HOA committee, Mark learned that the spring was just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the neighborhood lay a vast, untapped aquifer, potentially worth millions if developed responsibly. The HOA's greed had nearly cost the community its most precious resource. Now, with transparency and cooperation, Mark and his neighbors began planning sustainable water use that would benefit everyone. Standing by the spring one crisp morning, Mark felt a quiet satisfaction. What started as a fight for his rights had become a movement for justice, community, and respect for nature. And as the sun shimmered on the clear, flowing water, Mark smiled. He'd won, not just the spring, but the trust and unity of a neighborhood reborn.